The year is 480 BC. The place is the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans have held off a Persian army for 3 days. But the Spartans are not fighting the whole Persian army. They are fighting a single unit, a unit that does not retreat, a unit that does not break, a unit that, when one man falls, another steps forward from behind to take his place, so that the formation always numbers exactly 10,000. The Spartans cut down wave after wave, but the Persian ranks never thin. For every warrior who falls, another appears, identical in armor, identical in weaponry, identical in cold, silent discipline. The Greek historian Herodotus will later write that these soldiers were called the Immortals, because their numbers could never be reduced. Kill one, and a replacement rises like a ghost from the dust. 10,000 becomes 9,999 for only a heartbeat, and then it is 10,000 again. The Spartan king Leonidas looks across the battlefield and sees this endless tide of gold and iron. He does not show fear. He is a Spartan. But in that moment, he understands something terrible. He is not fighting men. He is fighting a machine. The first superpower the world had ever seen had built the first professional standing army the world had ever seen. And at its heart, its absolute core, stood the Persian Immortals, the king's elite guard, 10,000 unbreakable. Today, we are going to strip away the myth and the Hollywood exaggeration looking at you 300 inches and uncover the real story of the most famous military unit of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. We will learn who they were, how they fought, what they wore, and why their name still echoes across 3,000 years. By the time we finish, you will understand why the Immortals were not just bodyguards. They were the living symbol of an empire that ruled 40% of the human race. To understand the Immortals, you must first understand the empire that created them. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in 550 BC, was the largest empire the world had ever seen. At its height, it stretched from India to Ethiopia, from the steppes of Central Asia to the shores of the Aegean Sea. It contained over 50 million people, 40% of the world's population. It had a road system that allowed a message to travel from the capital Susa to the far city of Sardis in just 7 days. It had a postal service, a spy network, a standardized currency, and a system of provincial governors called satraps who collected taxes and kept the peace. This was not a barbarian horde. This was a sophisticated, multicultural, bureaucratic superpower. And like all superpowers, it needed a military, but not just any military. The Persian army was huge, hundreds of thousands of men drawn from every corner of the empire. Medes, Elamites, Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, Greeks, and dozens more. They fought with different weapons, different tactics, different languages. The Persian kings needed a core, a professional, permanent, loyal force that would serve as the backbone of the army and the last line of defense for the king himself. That force was the Immortals. The Greeks called them Athanatoi, the Immortals. The Persians called them Anushia, the Companions. They were 10,000 strong, drawn from the best soldiers in the empire, and they served the king and only the king. They were not mercenaries, they were not conscripts. They were full-time, lifelong professional soldiers, paid by the imperial treasury, housed in the palace complex, fed from the king's own table. Their loyalty was absolute. Their discipline was legendary. and their reputation was so fearsome that entire armies would surrender just because they saw the immortals' golden spears on the horizon. Now let us talk about the appearance of an immortal. This is where most modern depictions get it wrong. In the movie 300, the immortals are shown as faceless, masked, almost monstrous figures with blank silver faces and black robes. That is pure fantasy. The real immortals were among the most beautifully equipped soldiers of the ancient world. They wore a conical felt cap called a tiara, sometimes stiffened with resin and decorated with a metal band. They wore a brightly colored tunic with sleeves, often purple or red, over a linen or leather undergarment. Over the tunic, they wore a coat of scale armor, hundreds of small iron or bronze scales sewn onto a leather backing. Scale armor was flexible, strong, and relatively light. It could stop an arrow or a sword cut, and it glittered in the sun like the scales of a fish. On their legs, they wore trousers. The Persians wore trousers, which the Greeks considered barbaric and hilarious, but trousers are excellent for horseback riding and cold weather. On their feet, they wore leather boots or sandals. Their primary weapon was the bow. The immortals were expert archers, trained from childhood to shoot from horseback and on foot. They carried a composite bow made of wood, horn, and sinew that could shoot an arrow through a bronze shield. Their quiver held dozens of arrows. Their secondary weapon was a short, thrusting spear, about 6 to 7 feet long, with a leaf-shaped iron head and a metal counterweight at the butt. The shaft was often decorated with gold or silver bands, because the immortals were also a display of Persian wealth and power. Their tertiary weapon was a short sword or a large dagger called an Achaemenid, worn on the right hip. The Achaemenid had a scabbard decorated with gold and precious stones. And finally, they carried a shield, a large wicker or leather-covered shield, often shaped like a figure 8 or a crescent. The shield was light enough to carry on the march, but strong enough to deflect a javelin. The overall effect was not dark and menacing. It was bright, colorful, and terrifying in a different way. The immortals looked like they came from a world of unimaginable wealth and power. They looked like they belonged to a king who could afford to dress 10,000 men in gold and purple, and that, too, was a weapon. The message was clear. You are not fighting a tribe. You are fighting an empire. The most distinctive feature of the immortals was not their armor or their weapons. It was their organization. The immortals were 10,000 men exactly, not 9,000, not 11,000, 10,000. The number was sacred. 10,000 was the size of the original Persian army under Cyrus. 10,000 was the number that could conquer the world. The immortals were divided into 10 regiments of 1,000 men each. Each regiment was divided into 10 companies of 100. Each company was divided into 10 squads of 10. Every man knew his squad, his company, his regiment. Every man knew the men to his left and right. This decimal organization was revolutionary. It allowed the immortals to maneuver with a precision that other ancient armies could not match. The Persian king could order his immortals to form a line, a square, a wedge, or a column, and the orders would flow down the chain of command in seconds. But the most famous aspect of the immortals was their replacement system. When an immortal was killed, wounded, or fell sick, he was immediately replaced from a reserve corps of 10,000 additional men who trained constantly but did not fight unless needed. The replacement would arrive wearing the same armor, carrying the same weapons, looking almost identical to the man he replaced. To an enemy looking across the battlefield, it seemed as though the immortals never lost a man. They were, as Herodotus wrote, immortal, in the sense that their numbers never diminished. The psychological effect was devastating. Imagine fighting an enemy that you cannot thin. Imagine cutting down a dozen men, only to see a dozen more step forward, as fresh as if they had just begun. That is why armies broke before the Immortals. Not because the Immortals were invincible, because they were inexhaustible. Now let us talk about tactics. The Immortals fought in a formation that the Greeks called the Sparabara, the shield-bearers. In front of the Immortals stood a rank of shield-bearers, men who carried large rectangular wicker shields that covered their entire bodies. Behind them, the Immortals would shoot their bows over the shields. This created a moving wall of arrows. The enemy could not charge because the arrows would cut them down. The enemy could not stay still because the arrows would find them anyway. When the enemy formation was sufficiently weakened, the shield-bearers would open ranks and the Immortals would charge with their spears. This combined arms approach, archers behind shields, then a spear charge, was simple but brutally effective. It required immense discipline. The archers had to shoot in volleys, coordinating their release so that a wave of arrows would hit the enemy all at once. The shield-bearers had to hold their position even when the enemy threw javelins or charged. The spearmen had to wait for the signal, then move forward in perfect unison. The Immortals drilled these maneuvers for years. By the time they saw battle, they could execute them in their sleep. The Immortals also fought on horseback. About 1,000 of the 10,000 were mounted, a heavy cavalry force that served as the king's personal escort. These mounted Immortals wore the same scale armor as the foot soldiers, but carried longer spears and sometimes battle axes. They would charge into the enemy flank, break the formation, and then the foot Immortals would advance to finish the job. The cavalry Immortals were also responsible for scouting, pursuit, and protecting the king's chariot. The Immortals were not just warriors, they were also the king's palace guard, his ceremonial escort, and his secret police. 10,000 Immortals lived in the palace complex at Susa and Persepolis. They guarded the gates, the throne room, the treasury, and the king's private chambers. They were the only soldiers allowed to carry weapons in the king's presence. They also served as the king's executioners. When a traitor or a rebellious satrap was condemned, it was an Immortal who swung the sword. But the Immortals were also the king's public face. When the king traveled, the Immortals marched before him and behind him, their golden spear butts gleaming, their scale armor chiming like 1,000 tiny bells. The Immortals carried the king's golden throne on their shoulders. They carried the royal standards, the golden eagle, the golden sun, the golden lion. They were not hidden. They were displayed. They were the advertisement of Persian power. Every subject of the empire, from the Indus to the Nile, knew that if you saw the Immortals, you were in the presence of the King of Kings. Now let us witness the Immortals in their most famous battles. The Battle of Thermopylae, 480 BC. King Xerxes of Persia has invaded Greece with an army so vast that Herodotus claims it numbered over 2 million. Modern historians say perhaps 200,000, still enormous. The Greek city-states have united to oppose him. 300 Spartans, led by King Leonidas, hold the narrow pass of Thermopylae. For 2 days, the Greeks repel wave after wave of Persian infantry. The Immortals have not yet been committed. Xerxes waits. On the 3rd day, a Greek traitor named Ephialtes shows the Persians a mountain path that bypasses the pass. The Immortals are ordered to take the path. They march through the night, silent and disciplined. By dawn, they are behind the Greek lines. Leonidas realizes he is surrounded. He dismisses most of the Greek army, keeping only the Spartans, the Thespians, and the Thebans. They will fight to the death. The Immortals advance from the rear. The Spartans turn to face them. What happens next is not a battle, it is a slaughter. The Spartans fight with desperate courage, but they are exhausted, outnumbered, and now attacked from both sides. The Immortals do not hesitate. They do not pause. They advance in perfect formation, spears leveled, shields locked. They kill Leonidas. They kill every Spartan. They take the pass. But the delay has cost Xerxes dearly. The Greek navy defeats the Persian fleet at Salamis. Xerxes retreats. The Immortals have won the battle but lost the war. Their reputation, however, is sealed. From that day on, every Greek knows the name of the Immortals. The Battle of Plataea, 479 BC. The final land battle of the Persian invasion. The Persian general Mardonius commands the remaining Persian forces, including the Immortals. The Greeks, led by the Spartans under Pausanias, meet them on a plain near the city of Plataea. The Immortals fight with their usual discipline. They shoot their arrows. They advance with their spears. But the Greek hoplites, heavily armored infantry with long spears and large shields, are a terrible opponent for the Immortals. The Greek spear is longer. The Greek armor is heavier. The Greek formation, the phalanx, is designed to push. The Immortals are not push fighters. They are skirmishers and shock troops. They hold for a time, but the Greeks keep coming. Mardonius is killed, the Persian army breaks. The Immortals, for the first time in their history, retreat. They cover the retreat of the Persian survivors, fighting a rearguard action that saves thousands of lives. But they are defeated. The Persian invasion of Greece is over. The Immortals will never set foot in Europe again. But the Immortals did not disappear. They continued to serve the Persian kings for another 150 years. They fought against the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the rebellious satraps. They put down revolts and protected the empire's borders. Their last great battle was at Gaugamela in 331 BC, the same battle where Alexander the Great destroyed the Persian Empire. We have already told that story in another video, but here is the detail you need to know. At Gaugamela, the Immortals fought in the center of the Persian line, directly in front of King Darius III. They faced the Macedonian companion cavalry, led by Alexander himself. The Immortals did not break. They stood their ground. They fought for hours. They killed Macedonians. They wounded Alexander's horse. They pushed the companions back. But when Darius fled, for the second time in 2 years, the Immortals lost their reason to fight. They fought on even after their king had abandoned them. Some of them died where they stood, surrounded by Macedonian spears. Others surrendered and were absorbed into Alexander's army. Alexander was so impressed by the Immortals that he created his own elite guard, the Hypaspists, modeled on the Persian unit. He even called them the Immortals for a time. The Persian Immortals were gone, but their spirit lived on. In the armies of the successors, in the Roman Praetorian Guard, in every elite military unit that prides itself on being unbreakable. So what can we learn from the Persian Immortals? First, that numbers are not enough. The Persian Empire had millions of men, but the Immortals were 10,000. 10,000 men, properly trained, properly equipped, and properly led, can shape the destiny of a continent. Second, that logistics and organization are the true weapons of empire. The Immortals were not the strongest or the bravest warriors in history, They were not individually superior to Spartan hoplites or Macedonian phalangites. What made them superior was the system behind them, the replacement pool, the decimal organization, the professional pay, the lifelong training. That system was a product of the Persian Empire's administrative genius. Third, that reputation is a force multiplier. The name Immortals terrified enemies. That terror was not based on reality. The Immortals could be killed, they could be defeated, they could retreat. But the belief that they were unkillable was enough to make armies surrender before the first arrow was fired. Reputation is armor. Reputation is a weapon. The Immortals understood this. Fourth, that loyalty matters. The Immortals served the king, not a cause, not a country, not an ideology. They served a person, and when that person was strong, they were unstoppable. When that person was weak, when Darius ran, they were lost. The Immortals remind us that no army, no matter how elite, can survive the failure of its leader. Today, you can see the legacy of the Immortals at Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. The reliefs on the stairways of the Apadana Palace show the Immortals in stunning detail, their robes, their spears, their bows, their faces. The carvings are almost 3,000 years old. The Immortals are still there, frozen in stone, marching toward the king's throne. You can also see their ghosts in modern military traditions. The elite guard units of Iran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, have consciously invoked the legacy of the Immortals. The name Immortals has been used by armies from Rome to the Soviet Union, because the idea of an unbreakable unit, a unit that never retreats, a unit that fills its ranks as fast as they are emptied, that idea is too powerful to die. The Persians invented it. The world has been copying it ever since. So the next time you see a story about a special forces unit, or a bodyguard detachment, or a presidential guard, remember the Immortals. Remember the men who stood in the pass at Thermopylae, who charged at Plataea, who died at Gaugamela with their king's name on their lips. They were not invincible. They were not supernatural. They were simply the best trained, best organized, most disciplined professional soldiers of their age. And for 200 years, no army in the world could stand against them. The Immortals are gone. Persia is a memory. But the standard they carried, the golden eagle, the golden sun, the golden lion, still flies in the imagination of every soldier who has ever sworn to hold the line. 10,000 unbreakable, 10,000 immortal, not because they could not die, but because they refused to be forgotten. And we have not forgotten. We are here telling their story 3,000 years later. That is true immortality. That is the Persian Immortals, the king's elite guard, the shadow of an empire that once ruled the world.